Hello, we're here today with Robbie Alm, Executive Vice President of Hawaiian Electric. Robbie, how you doing?
Great to be here.
Good.
Good.
We're going to go over a few issues that Hawaiian Electric is dealing with. It's going to be going through a major transformation in the next, decade or so. We're going to find out a little bit about it. If you fly over Honolulu, if you fly over the islands, you'll see photovoltaics on rooftops. Practically every week there's a story or two about new types of renewable energy and progress with wind, biomass, biofuel, ocean.
You name it, we've got all of it here. We're very lucky. Hawaii's blessed.
Yeah, there's a great potential.
Huge.
In order to assimilate everything, we'd like to find out what Hawaiian Electric is going to have to go through to be able to handle all of these power sources and these different power sources in order to supply the energy needs of the state and of the island. Can you tell us what Hawaiian Electric will be going through? Will it need restructuring? Will it need new departments?
Essentially what we're going through, particularly here in Hawaii, is we're going from a place where there were a few large power plants, ours and others, that we collected energy from and then distributed throughout the system. The future will hold a lot more distributed generation, rooftop photovoltaics, or much smaller power plants or power generators spread out across the system. So it'll be our responsibility to collect all of that. There'll still be some big power plants. They may be wind plants as opposed to fossil fuel plants, or they may be biofuel plants instead of the current fossil fuel plants, but collect all of that energy together and then distribute it out across the system. So in some ways it'll be a far more sophisticated task than the one there is today. I think people have thought, well, we'll leave the generation business. That's probably not true, at least in the foreseeable future, because the heaviest sources of wind in Hawaii, of energy in Hawaii, are wind and solar. And those are fluctuating resources that need to be backed up. And at this point, we will probably be a significant part of that backup. As we find resources like geothermal, biomass, biofuels, and many of the forms of ocean energy, those are firm. Those behave very much like a conventional power plant. And as those come online, then there'll be less and less need for some of the current sources of backup power. As far as changes to the company, I think the major change is one we already made, which is we took the control room, the system operations area, and we took it out and made it a separate department, a separate area of the company. Because the future, as I said, is to have that area take in power from a much wider variety than the traditional and distribute it out. So it really becomes an important standalone function.
Well, what about the users of power? What are they going to expect, or is there something they need to plan for? Do they need any kind of backup systems, or will it be just a seamless transition?
I think it'll be relatively seamless. I mean, more and more people are putting power on their property, photovoltaics being the big example, though there is some increase in distributed wind, very small wind power, kinds of equipment that can be on an individual home or business. And it may be, as technology evolves, and you're right, we expect it to keep evolving quickly, it may be there are other small kinds of power plants you could have on your roof. So if you produce power on site, you can either put a battery there and give yourself storage of it, or use as much as you can and rely on the larger system to be your storage, if you will. But other than that, the average customer who doesn't put a small power plant on their own should really not see a difference. I mean, that's our goal, is that it would be seamless. It would just go from oil to all the kinds of local renewable energy we have.
I see. So then in that case, a large building, for example, would they benefit from having their own storage unit as opposed to, say, a single-family home that may not use as much power? Would that be something that they could get into?
I mean, not to avoid the question, but it's actually a math question. Storage right now is relatively expensive. So if you add that into the equation for a lot of businesses, it doesn't make sense. It's cheaper to essentially have the system be your storage. But some want it anyway for their own reasons. And we would expect prices of everything to come down over time, including the prices of on-site storage. So there's probably a point at which it would make sense. But right now it's your choice. You kind of do the math and decide for your business, is it the right thing to have on-site storage? For some it probably is. For others, it's probably better to rely on the system overall to provide your backup.
I see. In terms of the system then, all of these different sources that generate power, do they give the same type of power to Hawaiian Electric? In other words, do they produce the same kind of electricity that goes to the grid, or will there have to be some kind of modifications to handle any fluctuations or any variation in what Hawaiian Electric has to provide the ratepayers?
In one sense, it's all the same. An electron's an electron.
Right.
And so when it comes from the power generator, a wind farm or a power plant, and gets into the system, it's all the same. And those electrons move around the system and provide power. And, frankly, we can't tell what's a black electron and what's a green electron once it's in the system. The biggest difference is probably, the degree to which we can count on a steady flow. So from a conventional power plant or from sources like biomass or geothermal, which perform like the traditional kinds of units, it's a very steady flow of power. And we're unlikely to see significant fluctuations in it. With wind and sun, wind doesn't blow, wind blows, inconsistently. Sun, obviously not on at night, and even during the day we have clouds, or, last couple of days we had lots of rain. Then those units simply don't produce the same amount of electrons, or the amount they do fluctuates. We have to back that up, or they have to back it up on site. But once it's in the system, it's all the same, and we just move it around from wherever the producers of it are into everybody's homes and businesses.
All right. And in terms of the rates, what can businesses expect of the rates? Small businesses, for example, they need to know what they're up against in terms of costs and future costs so that they can plan accordingly. Larger businesses, maybe they could handle it, but even then, a businessman has to know future costs to survive.
And really, that's been, among all the other problems with oil, one of the biggest problems with oil, is its prices fluctuate based on events around the world over which we have no control. So you could have been planning at the beginning of 2011 for your utility bill based on what happened in 2010. And then the prices just skyrocketed during 2000. Nobody could plan for that. I mean, if you had had a budget, it would not have been in your wildest imagination that oil would increase the level it increased during the year. The great thing about local renewable energy is it's all either free, the source of the power, wind, sun, ocean, those are free. So what you're paying for is the cost of the piece of equipment that takes the energy out of the air or out of the sky and converts it to electricity. That's a capital cost. That you can predict. It's a fairly steady cost. Or the other energy like geothermal or biomass waste to energy has a fixed cost, a royalty or whatever. And again, you combine that with the capital cost of getting the power to you, it will be predictable. So we think it'll be cheaper. A lot of it already is cheaper. But on top of which, as we switch to local renewable energy, then you will be able to predict your prices. So I think the question is, the faster we get away from oil, the more predictable and we believe cheaper we can make your bill.
Well, that's I'm sure that's good news to a lot of people. In terms of labor, would you need a different kind of labor force? Would you need more workers? Or could you do it with the labor force that you have already?
Oh, no, I think there's job creation coming.
Any possibility percentage growth in terms of the labor force?
Hard to know, but they say, for example, that currently of the construction work in Hawaii today, 15% of it is based on solar. So, I mean, this is big stuff. I mean, if 15% of our construction business is solar energy, then there's lots of jobs with this out there. I think if it'll take people to run a plant. If we end up with biofuels, it'll be mechanized farming, so it's not stoop labor, but there will be labor involved in that. The more distributed generation you have, solar, wind, or other kinds of renewable energy, there's a whole group of people that have to install and then maintain those pieces of equipment. I mean, it isn't just something you put on a roof and walk away from. You know, we want those units to last 20, 30 years, so they need to be maintained.
They would require maintenance.
Exactly. So, as opposed to, a few big units, the more we distribute out, the more opportunities there are for job and for job growth. Some of it will take training, and I think there's some of that underway right now at the community colleges and others. The solar industry has just grown by leaps and bounds over the past few years, and they've been hiring people right and left. And I think most of the companies train their own folks, but I think there are training programs now being offered through community colleges. Some of what's coming is likely to be fairly sophisticated in the operation of plants. The folks who will run the geothermal plants of the future and the biomass plants of the future, that's a sophisticated piece of business. And, I would hope that we would be able to train our own folks, Hawaii folks, to take those jobs. But that's got to be one of the things we look at in the coming years is, are we getting training ready so it's our people who fulfill the renewable or fill the renewable energy jobs, not us importing people to run those kind of plants.
Right.
I mean, we may need expertise to start them, to get them going, but once they're going, we should be able to do that work.
What about the reliance of neighbor island sources to power the guzzling Oahu, which requires a lot of power?
Oahu is the industrial center for the state, so it has big harbors, the refineries, the industrial center of Hawaii, and the largest tourist center, Waikiki, which funds a lot of the state, are all on this island. And, it's kind of, you choose whether you live in this urban center, which Oahu really is, or whether you choose the more rural lifestyle of a neighbor island. I think the reality is the neighbor islands have sources of energy. Oahu doesn't. Geothermal basically exists on younger islands where there's still live or relatively recent dormant volcanoes. I mean, that's where we're going to get the geothermal from. So by definition, Kauai and Oahu are kind of out of it. And it's Maui maybe and Big Island. And so a lot depends on how you look at it, how you frame it. I think currently the leadership on Maui and the Big Island are kind of looking at themselves and saying, we could export energy. I mean, we can build up employment sources on our island to create renewable power that we would then essentially sell to Oahu. The big thing that Oahu brings to that equation is a large rate base. So if you live on a neighbor island, you are paying very high rates for electricity.
Right.
Part of that is there are very few people on the island to support the system. So the Big Island is huge. I mean, literally, it is a big island. You fit all the other islands on it. It has a relatively small population. They pay a lot to support a huge infrastructure of wires running around that island with very few people to pay for it, which is why the rates are so high. If we linked our islands together with a cable and went to one statewide rate structure,
You think it would even out?
Their rates would drop dramatically. Along with the economic development on their island of selling power. That's how the two current mayors see it, Arakawa and Kenoi. There are people who say, well, why should we help Oahu? They use too much power and we don't. It's sort of it's the old, how do you view it? Do you view this as a negative because we're being asked to create power that Oahu would use? Or do you look at that and say, one, it's a huge opportunity for economic development on the neighbor islands, which doesn't necessarily involve that many people, so we're not talking about shifting the population from Oahu to the neighbor islands. And secondly, at that point, Oahu would owe the neighbor islands the power of their rate base to lower their costs. So I personally think it's a positive exchange. I know there are people who see it differently, but it would also allow us as a state, us as a place, to largely get off oil. And that, for the future of these islands, for our kids, would, to me, be one of the greatest things we could ever do, is detach from this dependence on overseas oil, which there's no good, I mean, there's nothing right about that. You know, it pollutes, it comes from dangerous places, it fuels wars right now that our kids end up going and fighting. I mean, I don't see anything positive about it, that we should want to stay on that as opposed to go to renewable.
Okay, very good. Anything else you'd like to say about this?
One of the things that I think it's important to understand about Hawaiian Electric is we really don't make any money by virtue of being on oil. I mean, whatever the oil costs are, we simply pass them through to our customers. We don't make any money or profit off of that. So for us, switching to renewable energy doesn't come at a price tag in terms of our bottom line. It's the same for us. What's different for us is just as you were saying earlier, it gives us an opportunity to control our own destiny, to have sources and prices that we can rely on.
The local population to support their destiny?
Right. Yeah, that at that point we know where our power is coming from. It's coming from our islands. We know what it's going to cost because this stuff, again, is either fixed or free cost energy, and then, you know, the capital cost is like a whole mortgage. I mean, you pay it off over time, but you know what your payments are. So it frees us of all of that. For a company that's operating to bring you energy to your home, being able to know where it's coming from, what its price is going to be, and be able to understand its availability going out over the coming years would be much, much better than this world we live in today, where I can't tell you tomorrow when we go into the market to buy oil what that oil is going to cost, or even if it's going to be available, or if there's going to be a problem with the tanker that brings that from the Middle East to Hawaii. I mean, all of those are issues and risks of the business we have now that if we could switch to local renewable energy, we'd be in great shape. As you pointed out at the very beginning, no matter what, our role will be to move this around. You know, if we could be relieved of that overseas fuel oil price risk and instead be moving around local energy, then we could concentrate on what we actually enjoy the most and do the best with, which is how do we take all these different sources but deliver you a steady state of electricity.
That's a nice thought. And in terms of how much time it will take, can you predict the time?
Actually, we've got 1,000 megawatts worth of renewable projects at some level of either negotiation or implementation.
This is
right
new
now.
sources?
Right. You know, that's a lot. You know, now, you know, it's 1,600 megawatts statewide, and the 1,000, you know, doesn't give us 1,000 worth of power, so we need a lot more than that. But that's a big number. I mean, Hawaii is really moving faster on this scale than probably any place in the world, certainly any place in the United States. And, you know, that's great. I mean, I think this has a real opportunity in Hawaii to reach numbers up to, and depending on geothermal, 100% for electricity. Certainly the Big Island and Maui have a real opportunity to be off of oil within a decade.
Wow.
That's a dream worth chasing.
Okay, very good. Well, that's also economic security.
Absolutely.
Okay. Robbie, thanks very
Sure.
much for your time today.
My pleasure.